Eddie Van Halen's classic guitar tone, known as the Brown sound, has always inspired generations of guitar players. So many of us fans wanted to get that tone. Eddie used to keep it a secret and laughed it off when asked about the gear he was using, but now it's not a secret anymore. In this video, we'll take a closer look at the gear Eddie Van Halen used on the first Van Halen album and tour. Eddie Van Halen's classic sound is actually built on a humbucker-equipped guitar and cranked-up Marshall amp. Eddie used his iconic Frankenstrat for parts of the album. He also used a 1970s Ibanez Destroyer on the first album. Eddie Van Halen primarily used a 1967-68 Marshall 1959 Super Lead amp for the first album and tour, modified with a Variac to achieve his signature sound by lowering the voltage to drive the amp harder. He would turn all the knobs to 10, controlling the volume and distortion with the Variac. Actually, it increased the distortion within the amp. By lowering the voltage, basically what happens is you end up starving the entire amp. The power tubes and preamp tubes run colder, which causes them to distort more. The output transformers runs colder too. Basically, everything is starved within the amp, which creates not only less volume, but also increases distortion and compression. To clarify, it should be noted that when Eddie set his Variac at his 89 volts, he also rebiased the tubes in conjunction with that lower input voltage. This will allow it to sound warmer and mitigate the harshness. So what exactly did the Variac do? It lowered the voltage. Van Halen would use the Variac to reduce the wall's standard voltage, ergo 120 volts or 220 volts, to a lower level around 90-110 volts. Increased gain by starving the tubes of voltage, the amp had less headroom. This forced the amplifier into a more saturated, overdriven state at lower volume levels. Created sag, the reduced voltage caused the power tubes to sag or compress under the signal, contributing a unique, compressed, and powerful feel to the sound. Enabled lower volume performance. The primary reason was to make the extremely loud 100-watt Marshall usable in smaller venues, such as the clubs where Van Halen started. He could have the amp's gain and tone characteristics all cranked up, but at a more manageable volume level. A common myth is that Van Halen used a Variac to boost the voltage. This is incorrect, and doing so can damage the amplifier. He always used it to reduce the voltage. Some people suggest that Eddie Van Halen used an attenuator. He would turn a cranked plexi into a distortion pedal that could be reamped or plugged into a direct injection box. That sounds like a good solution, but there's a difference between using a Variac and a traditional attenuator. A Variac reduces the incoming voltage to the amp, while a traditional attenuator is placed between the amp and the speaker to absorb power. A Variac changes the incoming AC voltage to an entire amplifier, affecting the entire circuit by lowering the plate voltage and changing the amp's tone and distortion characteristics. An attenuator is placed between the amp's power output and the speaker to reduce the volume by converting power into heat, acting like a resistor. So now it's known that Eddie used a Variac to get his sound. Here's what he said in 2017. I went to this place called Dial Radio and asked, do you have any kind of like an industrial variable voltage transformer that I can use like a light dimmer? And he said, yeah, I got this thing called the Variac. I said, okay, cool. And I take it home and plug the amp into it, and I would lower the voltage from like 110 slowly down to 100. The lowest I ever went was like 60. Depending on the room we were playing, I'd set it anywhere between 60 and 100 because the only way the amp sounded good was with everything all the way up, so that became my volume knob. If we were playing little bars, I'd set it to like 60 volts. Somewhere a little bit bigger, I'd crank it to 80. And for recording, the sweet spot seemed to be 89 volts. Eddie Van Halen did use guitar pedals primarily for modulation, delay, and boost effects, especially for solos. He did not use distortion pedals because he believed they colored the amp's natural tone too much. He generated the desired distortion and overdrive by pushing his amplifiers to their limits. So let's take a closer look at the pedalboard Eddie Van Halen used on the first album and tour in 1978. On his first tour, his pedals were connected in a simple chain directly in front of his amplifier. The guitar signal went into an MXR Phase 90, followed by an MXR 117 flanger, an MXR 6 band EQ, a Maestro Echoplex, and a Univox EC80A tape echo, which were then plugged into his Marshall amp. The Echoplex and Univox tape echoes were controlled via remote switches, and the EQ pedal was kept on almost continuously to add mid-range to his sound. Eddie Van Halen started using the MXR Phase 90 and Echoplex in the mid-1970s, likely around 1975 or 1976. He first discovered the Phase 90 when a friend, Terry Kilgore, had one. Eddie started using both pedals together on a homemade pedalboard with the MXR flanger. He used this setup featuring the MXR Phase 90, Echoplex, and flanger taped to a piece of plywood throughout his early career, including the recording of Van Halen 1 album. Here are the guitar pedals Eddie Van Halen used to create his tone, which could be heard on the first album and tour. The Phase 90 was used on nearly every solo from the first album and can be heard on other timeless tracks throughout his career. Eddie Van Halen used MXR Phase 90 on tracks like Eruption, Ain't Talking About Love, and Atomic Punk. It contributed to his sound on many songs from the first album with subtle, compressed effect, often used during solos. Other songs where the Phase 90 was used include Everybody Wants Some. On Eruption, the phase effect is featured prominently on the iconic instrumental track. On Ain't Talking About Love, it is used for the solo, adding saturation and compression. On Atomic Punk, the phase effect is a key component of its sound. On Everybody Wants Some, it is used to create the distinctive swirling textures. The MXR 117 flanger was used for a more pronounced sweep. You can hear it on songs like Atomic Punk and parts of Ain't Talking About Love. Eddie always used an EQ. That was the secret to his live tone in the early days. The first pedal he had was a MXR 6 band EQ. This was a graphic EQ used to shape the tone and boost the signal, particularly on solos. A bit later, he had a 10-band EQ on his pedalboard. Maestro Echoplex is a tape echo unit that provided delay effects, often with the preamp being used to boost the signal. Eddie Van Halen used the Echoplex EP3 on many tracks, notably for that spaceship sound like an Eruption solo and the slapback delay in Ain't Talking About Love. The Echoplex preamp was also used to thicken his tone on the first few classic Van Halen albums. Eruption, the runaway spaceship sounds at the end of the solo, were created using the Echoplex, specifically by manipulating the delay head. On Ain't Talking About Love, the characteristic slapback delay effect was created with the Echoplex. The Echoplex EP3 was used for its tone sweetening preamp on the first several classic Van Halen records, such as the debut album, where it was used on tracks like Running with the Devil, You Really Got Me, and Jamie's Crying. Univox EC80A Tape Echo. Eddie used the Univox EC80A Tape Echo primarily on the song Eruption to create the characteristic pitch diving effect at the end. He manipulated the unit by turning it all the way up, causing a pitch dive as the tape speed slowed down. While Eruption is the most famous example, the Univox EC80 was also used for other delays, such as the solo on Atomic Punk. This is what Eddie said in an interview in 1980. That is a $50 Univox EC80 Echo Box. A real cheap thing that works off a cartridge. It is like a miniaturized 8-track cartridge. One day some kid turned me onto it, and all of a sudden I hit a note, turned it all the way up, and got that growl. I go, whoa. So I mounted it in an old World War II practice bomb that I picked up in a junkyard. I read reviews and papers that have said Eddie Van Halen with a synthesizer solo. Actually, all it is a $50 piece of junk. Remote switches. Eddie used remote switches to control the Maestro, Echoplex, and Univox units, used to turn the Echoplex and Univox on and off as needed. For the first album and tour, Eddie Van Halen reportedly used a combination of JBL D120s and Celestion G12M speakers. He used JBL speakers in one cabinet for a brighter tone, while other cabinets were loaded with more classic Celestion G12M 25-watt speakers. This approach is a combination cabinet setup where the different speakers create a hybrid tone.
Hey guys, if you liked this video, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.